Hello, I'm Mark Farrington, Group Vice President for GlobalLogic here in UK and Ireland, and I'm delighted to be joined by Jacob Morgan of Forrester. Joins me today to talk about, as we come into 2023, how organisations are preparing themselves for the longer term through troubling, difficult times in 2023 and thereafter, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting because we did the study for you in 2021, and adaptability was one of the sort of big findings coming out of that. Partly from where people were in the pandemic. We might have thought that that would be a lower priority today, but the circumstances that we've seen as a result of challenges in Ukraine and the global sort of economic position has meant that adaptability has actually persisted and become sort of just as important and is still very much part of the agenda today. We're also seeing a shift in innovation. Innovation was part of what people were focusing on before back in 2021. But there it was, then it was more about that sort of moonshot innovation. Now we're seeing a kind of reining in and a recognition of the innovation opportunity, the innovation teams as a tool within the business to focus on some of the core business problems that businesses are looking at the moment. So, for example, in financial services, they're really starting to hone in on things like financial well-being and helping customers through some of the difficult economic times they're facing at the moment. From an energy, utility and waste management side, again, it's sort of starting to think through how in this sort of post-pandemic digital strategy world that we find ourselves in with the capabilities that we built for customers, how do we actually optimize those? How do we rebuild or integrate with sensors or integrate with smart meters more effectively? Or, what does digitization mean for the larger firm, for example?
So when we think about innovation, we generally think about it in two dimensions, business or operational innovation, and then the underpinning technology. How do you see the focus of those two playing out within our customer base and within the market generally?
What we're seeing is technology itself is very much a tool to deliver to both of those constituents. And we're starting to see people look for those opportunities where they can deliver the business model opportunity and the business model outcomes for their customers, but also deliver more operational effectiveness at the same time. So in an ideal world, you'll be able to move both of those forward with your use of technology, and that's essentially what adaptive organizations are doing. They're looking at how they can creatively use that technology in order to meet the needs of their customers now, but also predict the needs in the future and start designing for those, and using innovation as one of the core tools to do that. So we're seeing business and operations sort of come together, and the efficiency play is really the mantra at the moment. So it's less about that moonshot, it is more about pragmatic efficiency. Where do we have sand in the Vaseline, friction in the process that we need to address in order to drive the business forward, reduce cost, reduce time to market, lower overheads? It's that sort of shift rather than the moonshot, as it were.
And how do you see one of the big focus areas of innovation during the pandemic was digitalization of channels, maintaining customer contact? And I think the customers, increasingly touch points with customers change as that touch point becomes less physical. People don't come into a branch, they engage via a mobile application. How are organisations thinking about the services that they deliver through that digital channel?
I think they're tending to think more in a sort of modular and composable way. So design a service that can potentially then be distributed via multiple channels. So rather than design for the channel, you're designing the fundamental component that can then serve that customer contact, utilizing the elements of the particular technology it's then implanted into. So, for example, a component that can then sit inside or sit behind a chatbot. So you're really focusing and doubling down on the artificial intelligence, on the natural language generation, on the fundamental components of that, rather than designing purely for that particular chatbot. That service can then be reused in another channel, for example. And it's breaking down those elements, because what we also see is we're in a much more sort of interconnected environment. So it's less about bringing your it's more about sort of taking your products and services to customers rather than bringing them to you. So you're likely to have servicing via somebody else's Apple platform, or indeed in the world of financial services, that's my sort of core area. we're seeing a lot of embedded finance. So, we've all been there, we've all checked out on a web page and there's a buy now, pay later option or whatever. That's embedded finance. So it's about delivering those components and those capabilities in such a way that you can design once, reuse multiple times in multiple touch points, multiple environments, and breaking it down into that. This is where your design thinking teams come in, and that sort of customer depth of understanding, because in order to do that effectively, you have to have those feedback loops and that insight coming in from the customer to be able to then really understand what they need and is what you're doing serving those needs. And I think that was one of the interesting things we found in the pandemic. People were digitizing, and then one of the reasons when we ran the survey in 2021 that we saw people being uncertain about the longevity of their digital strategy was that a lot of their assumptions were now being questioned because they'd accelerated into digital, and they were perhaps finding things weren't quite as, the outcomes weren't quite what they expected. So, yeah, exactly. So it's really important to have those loops in place that allow you to tie back the insight and the outcome in order to move the business forward. And that's really what adaptive firms are doing.
And that customer feedback loop, or that outside in design thinking, is the way that we think about it within GlobalLogic. That outside in design thinking, how are you seeing customers adapt their business and technology organizations to come together to address some of that feedback?
I mean, certainly a lot of what we've seen has been the kind of decomposition of the technology teams into, and indeed business teams, into more sort of smaller blocks, smaller units. So, iterative design methodologies, things like Agile, Scrum teams, where you're essentially embedding all of the components that all of the people that you need in order to deliver the change that you need in that particular team. People like Lloyd's have done this quite effectively. So they had customer lab teams that would look across the customer journey, bringing in specialists that would really understand how the customers were engaging and interacting, because it's a very specialist set of skills. But then they would have, those labs would essentially design the process and spec out what needed to happen. And then they would have a separate set of implementation teams, again, small kind of DevOps oriented teams that focus very much at optimizing what they did. But again, the business and the technology have those crossovers. They have, you might have an engineer in that lab team, you might have a business person in that DevOps team, so that the conversation and the dialogue is constant. So it's not a case of over the wall and that sort of waterfall delivery that we used to see in the past. So bringing those cross-functional teams together and making sure they're populated with a variety of skills that serves all aspects of what you're wanting to achieve within that particular development team.
And I guess those enterprise organizations that are making that shift to more agile-based development practices, we would typically associate those with perhaps digital natives, startups, FinOps type organizations. How are enterprises beginning to view some of those startup organizations that sit around them in the supply chain and the customer engagement that they've got today? How's that coming together?
It's a really interesting one, because we're starting to see businesses recognize that how they deliver is perhaps through a patchwork of organizations. They're not, I say they're not. Some of them still are very precious about ownership and owning the customer and owning what matters most to that customer is where you develop your brand. But that doesn't mean you have to own every single piece of interaction. So we're starting to see, digital banks, some of the challenger banks, take a marketplace approach where they serve up the current account, they then serve up something like the credit card through another supplier, another bank as a service provider. They might serve up the insurance through a different one. And they're not turning their customers away. Instead, they're offering their customers to other businesses to create, and designing services that share data, share information. So it's not just a cold handoff, it's a warm handoff. There's, information embedded about your insurance in the banking app that the digital bank has, and vice versa. So they're starting to weave together these more complex customer journeys, really sort of mesh them together. Mashups would be the way we would have talked about it in the 90s.
it's interesting as well. It's not even in the same sector. If I think about my own retail bank mobile application, and there's now a set of partner subscription services, right the way from media services to publication subscriptions that I can subscribe to via my mobile banking application. And you're beginning to see some of those come together, and perhaps enterprises consider their customer touch point as a pseudo platform.
Yes,
in that engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw a massive sort of push to deliver this in China, where they kind of skipped a phase of digitization and went straight to mobile, and that really enabled people to have very powerful technology in their hands that could really open up that digital world for them. You know, that was their point of entry. But solutions like Ant Financial and Alipay, solutions like WeChat, they brought together, you know, Paytm in India, was it Gojek in Indonesia? They brought together a whole set of services unified around customer identity, unified around payment enablement, which is the core proposition within a financial services firm. So we are seeing more and more of that approach, or people looking selectively at that approach in places like the UK where we are at the moment. So, for example, building societies, or not necessarily building societies, banks and building societies are looking at building specific ecosystems around home buying, even more niche ones around rental and home rental, which then can tie in, feeding the utility firms the information when a rental takes place, so that the landlord can buy into a landlord app that manages some of that, as well as the rental, the people that are renting the property themselves, who can have a different app that looks onto the same set of services to manage their own household finances. Some of that's enabled by open finance and open APIs. So you're starting to see these technologies enable these kind of mashups, this reweaving of customer experience that extends way beyond that core industry and brings together different industries. And that will get more and more interesting because we're on the cusp of open finance. We've got open banking in the UK, we've got PSD2 in Europe, various versions of that around the world. That then leads on to open data and open finance and then open data. We've got the European Commission building data spaces specifically for inter-industry sharing of data itself. You can really start to see how, if used wisely and effectively, that can really start to move the needle for customer experience and insight, and a whole host of industries can benefit.
So we talked a bit about innovation and how it's playing out in regulated sectors such as financial services and the energy space. If you had to give one piece of practical advice for an organisation in 2023 looking to drive innovation, what would it be?
So this is where I earn my money. The piece of advice I would give is things are going to get more challenging before the road evens out. So we're still going uphill at the moment. What you need to think about is aligning what you're working on from a technology perspective, where you're spending your investment, right? Where you're investing with the business outcomes. So making sure that what you do is very much tied to how you're driving forward your customers, how you're meeting their needs, how you're also meeting the overarching objectives of the business. Because we will see more pressure. Budgets are okay at the moment, but we will see more pressure on tech budgets going forward. So if you can ensure that you're couching your developments, your initiatives in the language of the business and talking about the outcomes they drive for the business, that's going to give you much more security in terms of being able to work on the elements that drive the business forward, rather than, from an innovation perspective, some of those moonshots. So it's that sort of pragmatic focus, but doubling down on what moves the business forward, what ultimately drives customer satisfaction and trust.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your time and your insight. Very much appreciated. And we'll see how it plays out in 2023.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.